The late 90s to the early 2000s was perhaps one of the more pivotal timeframes in gaming's early history. Characterized by rapid advancements in hardware and the groundbreaking releases of the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox consoles, this era witnessed the emergence of iconic games such as Half-Life, Counter-Strike, Grand Theft Auto 3, The Legend of Zelda, Halo, and numerous others. The Need for Speed franchise only found its place in this illustrious roster much later in 2003, thanks to the release of Need for Speed Underground, finally solidifying its position within the mainstream gaming landscape. In any case, the remarkable triumph of Underground owes much to the progressive groundwork laid by preceding titles, forming the solid foundation for its massive success. Arguably, one such game that significantly pushed the envelope further was Need for Speed 4, branded as high stakes in some countries and road challenge in others. Despite not typically being included amongst the greatest or most influential games of all time like the games I've just listed, High Stakes is a gem that undoubtedly warrants an honorable mention for playing an instrumental role in paving the way for Need for Speed's subsequent mainstream success and being way ahead of its time in numerous fronts. This retrospective hence endeavors to shed light on what I consider to be one of the more underappreciated titles nearly a quarter of a century later. So let's unearth a hidden gem in racing and delve into the roads less traveled by Need for Speed 4. Need for Speed first ignited its engine all the way back in 1994 for initially a console called 3DO, but thankfully later on the PlayStation 1 and the PC. I myself had no idea this console even existed, to be honest, and my introduction to the series was later in 1997 with the release of Need for Speed 2. The Need for Speed was a technical marvel in its own right. It may look like hot garbage today, but remember that this was back in 1994. We're talking before the GUI-based Windows 95 was released, where people used DOS on computers with a whopping 4 megabytes of RAM. Need for Speed 2 improved on every level from the original, but it's Need for Speed 3 and its very close cousin 4 that pushed the boundaries in 2 very short years, showcasing an evident leap forward. Some purists amongst you may argue that Need for Speed 3, or even PC or console versions of either 3 or 4, is the best game of the bunch. For the uninitiated, Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit might strike an eerie resemblance to Need for Speed 4, and you wouldn't be wrong. In a way, High Stakes can be regarded as a more polished evolution of its predecessor, bolstering every facet of an already outstanding game rather than being considered a standalone IP for some. There will be some nostalgia at play here, and I respect varying tastes and preferences, but I will be taking the PC version of High Stakes for the sake of this retrospective. Okay, so what exactly made Need for Speed 4 so special? Well, we'll first need to take a look at the racing landscape of that era. In the very narrow timeline of 1997 and 1999, we definitely had many options, but it's just that almost every game had a catch and not for the better. There was Test Drive 5, which looked okay but had numerous frustrating flaws, one of which was the lack of speed and overall poor driving experience. Rush 2 on the Nintendo 64 was a fun experience driving and doing stunts, but was otherwise not in the same league in every other category. Speed Devils on the Dreamcast was an okay game, but again, boasted nothing special in anything else, especially in its driving department. And then there were the countless rally games of that era, and honestly, some of them were quite good, but they catered for a very niche audience and got boring for the average gamer quite quickly. Amongst these okay games, there was one that stood out. Even though it was released a few months after Need for Speed 4, the only game that could be considered to be in the same league was Gran Turismo 2, which honestly still looks decent today when emulated on modern hardware. It was undoubtedly a deeper game with more cars and tracks, but just like its rally counterparts, it catered towards car enthusiasts. If you didn't care about cars as a hobby, then the game's excruciating detail on driving experience would feel boring to you. It also was a PlayStation exclusive, so that did not help either. So comparing these two games to one another directly wouldn't feel right, as they were meant for mostly different audiences. Of course, all of what I've mentioned so far applied only to that specific time frame. There is such an enormous difference between games released in 1999 and those released just a year or two later, as we experience perhaps the biggest generational leap. Have a look at the difference between the aforementioned Gran Turismo 2 of 1999 and Gran Turismo 3 of 2001. Need for Speed Porsche Unlimited of 2000 versus Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 of 2002. One other favorite example of mine is the comical difference between FIFA 2000 and FIFA 2001. Even off-road redneck racing, yes, that is a real game from 2001, looked so much better than games from the late 90s. I could give many other examples, but you get the point. In 2 short years, games arguably took the biggest leap in graphical fidelity. But going back to the 90s and Need for Speed 4 specifically, I think it was the best looking racing game if you had one of those now defunct 3DFX Voodoo cards. Regrettably, much like the most of you, I was only able to play this game on my dad's old Gateway laptop using software rendering. But even then it looked the most grounded and most realistic out of the bunch, and I loved that. Emulating the game today on my modern PC, thanks to its dedicated modding community, has given me a newfound appreciation for its visual appeal. When I saw the light reflections on the car's body for the first time almost 2 decades later, I was shocked. I had no idea the game could look this good back then. That said, it wasn't just the in-game racing. The game's UI design overall was so clean that I loved spending just as much time in the showroom looking at the cars. Need for Speed games back then also had these amazing extras, like allowing you to get into the cockpit of the car and look around in 3D. 3D back in 1999. Imagine being a kid with no access to the internet in the late 90s, but being able to see the inside of a McLaren F1. You were also treated with a slideshow of the cars, as you were narrated additional details about the car itself.
F50 has been described as a street-legal Formula One racer, and that title isn't too far from the truth.
These features were later dropped in later installments in the franchise, and it's something that I miss and enjoy exploring all the way back from Need for Speed 2. The great selection of music in the background also elevated this whole experience. As much as the visual presentation and graphics of the game were remarkable, they weren't the sole allure. At its core, if the driving experience sucks, then none of these would matter. And even without any fancy effects, motion blur, or any other visual tricks used in today's games, Need for Speed 4 gave you a great sense of speed while remaining relatively grounded. It trod the perfect line between arcade and simulation, and that's where the widest audience resides. Even with a wide angle, you could sense the heft of your car surging through the roads, and palpably felt the loss of speed and momentum when you cornered suboptimally or engaged in spirited encounters with fellow racers. The cockpit camera's interior details were nothing to write home about, but it conveyed the sensation of being behind the wheel just fine at the time, especially with its heightened sense of speed that captivated how easily you'd crash with one bad maneuver. The bumper camera further compounded the sense of speed with its proximity to the asphalt and louder engine noises. Look, I'm not saying that the physics was perfect, but it was really, really good. Getting physical with other cars on the road was underwhelming at best in other titles, but in high stakes, half the fun was messing around with other cars. You could be that guy and use the pit maneuver against your opponents, and the cars would behave as you'd expect them to. The AI sometimes even honks back at you when you drive recklessly. I also cannot confirm nor deny that I pushed cars into devastating crashes or into train tracks as a kid. You also felt the suspension system of your car after landing a large jump, and weather effects like the rain and snow heavily impacted traction, as those tracks were significantly harder to drive in. Lastly, it's important to note that each car offered a unique driving experience, ensuring that no two rides felt the same for the most part. The Corvette handled significantly differently than the BMW or the F50 compared to the Diablo. This added weight to the decision of selecting a car for a specific tournament or simply preferring one over the other solely for its joy of driving. All in all, the game's world and the cars mesmerized me as a child, as it managed to strike a remarkable balance by offering a sense of realism without compromising any of the exhilarating fun. In addition to everything mentioned so far, there was one particular element in the game that served as a catalyst to the fun, chaotic racing experience: the game's groundbreaking damage system. It stood head and shoulders above any other game at the time, introducing a level of sophistication that we simply had not seen before. The damage inflicted to your cars in high stakes went beyond mere cosmetic effects, as it directly affected the functionality of your car during races. There were 4 key aspects to worry about: the engine, the steering, the body, and the suspension, each exerting a distinct influence on your car's performance. The damage system started with basic effects like losing headlights and taillights, but it didn't end there. Depending on the impact location, your car's glass could shatter, while the body damage was meticulously modeled based on the angle and crash zone. For instance, a head-on collision would visibly bend the front bumper inward at the point of impact, and even a rear-end contact could cause the spoiler to deform. Accumulating enough damage to the body and steering would result in a wobbling tire, and pushing it further would affect all the tires. If you continue to drive your car like an animal, then you'll eventually watch one of your rims screech against the asphalt, sparking half the track. Your engine will also start smoking and start making these obnoxiously loud, worrying noises as well. It was astonishing to witness how each car bent, twisted, and broke individually as a kid driving recklessly. Heck, even the position of the engine mattered here, as cars like the McLaren F1 or the Ferrari F50 experienced minimal engine damage during races, since most collisions occurred at the front or sides of the vehicle rather than the rear. The level of detail achieved in this game, considering its age, was simply incredible for its time. I don't use this word lightly, but I think I would be comfortable calling the physics behind the damage system and its impact on the driving experience as nothing short of revolutionary. I mean, just look at how I absolutely demolished this beautiful Ferrari F50 and how much its performance suffered as a result. This Italian beauty's once proud stance is now distorted as the car doesn't even stand straight anymore. To be fair, it's almost impossible for you to damage your car so badly in just one race, but the state of your car is retained throughout and will only get worse with each race until you repair it. You can repair each aspect of your car one at a time, or pay the full price to repair it all in one go. Watching the repair animation as the car morphed back to its original skeleton was, and still is, super satisfying to watch. It felt akin to repairing and polishing the battle-worn armor that just returned back from a gruesome battle. You also may have noticed that repairing costs money, so let's talk about the all-important career mode. As alluded to earlier, most games in the era usually had arcade game modes where you picked your settings and hopped right into the racing. The only game that had any deep career mode was the legendary Gran Turismo back in 1997, where you could buy and sell cars and enter various tournaments. It gave a sense of progression and something to play for, rather than the short burst of fun that all other arcade racers aimed for at the time. As I touched earlier though, Gran Turismo was just too much for non-enthusiasts. Most of the cars you raced with were stock, average cars you'd see on the road. The game focused more on simulating real-life physics rather than exhilarating with a sense of speed. And for heaven's sake, later iterations of the franchise even introduced licenses that you had to obtain before entering tournaments. Okay, to be fair, none of the aspects I've just listed should be deemed negative. On the contrary, they are a set of specifically tailored attributes that appeal to a niche audience, those who have a genuine passion for cars and a penchant for realistic simulations. Need for Speed High Stakes adopted a similar approach, but aimed for greater accessibility to the average gamer. You start the game with a modest budget and can only afford either a 99 Mercedes-Benz SLK 230 or a 98 BMW Z3 Roadster. You then enter the first tournament vying for a top 3 finish to earn a medal and unlock subsequent tournaments. These later races grew progressively lengthier and more challenging on average, some even demanding specific car classes or brands along with hefty entry fees. Some of the more fun races amongst the bunch involved a duel with an opponent. The name High Stakes aptly described those where you'd go head-to-head against a car of the same class, and, with both cars on the line, the first to finish kept them both. The money you earn then must be carefully allocated between repairing your cars, upgrading them, and buying new ones for the showroom. You could upgrade each car 3 levels, and you got some sweet stripes at level 3. Also, since the career mode has no manual save functionality, there is no backtracking. After each race, the game automatically saved your progress, intensifying the gravity of driving recklessly and risking the destruction or loss of your car in high-stakes races. This did elevate the level of difficulty for the average player, but it came with the added benefit of immersing you in the game with a palpable sense of investment. You see, this career mode, the one that's been missing in all racing games but Gran Turismo and Need for Speed 4, may seem like a simple concept, but they were pioneers in adding proper, long-form content in otherwise good games that desperately needed a reason to play for. Something to manage, think about, and plan outside of the racing that you do. An incentive to strike a balance between speed and caution to finish the race first and in one piece. Apart from career mode, High Stakes also returns with the Hot Pursuit races that were first introduced in its predecessor. You can play as either the cop or the racer, and the cop's action and voice lines were excellent for its time. Although Hot Pursuit is fun to play for a few times, it gets old pretty quickly. Once again, it suffers from the same problem that I just mentioned a moment ago. There's nothing really to play for. You can play a race or two to have a short burst of fun, but you wouldn't play this mode for hours on end. There's just no point. It would have been fantastic if the cops were somehow a part of the career mode tournament to add another fun layer to the races, but alas, it's just an arcade mode. All that said, the career mode itself wasn't perfect either. Anyone who has completed the game will tell you that some of the races just drag on for far too long. The 8 lap per race tournament is the worst offender, as I dreaded to complete those races back in the day. Thankfully, there is enough variation to keep things interesting enough to push through, but the developers have used the old trick of reversing the tracks and changing the weather to quote-unquote add more variety. Need for Speed 4 doesn't have many glaring issues, but if I had to pick one, it would be this partially contrived longevity of some of the tournaments. Of course, more cars and tracks would have been also nice, as Gran Turismo demolishes high stakes in this category. The modern community did add many new cars and tracks that you can download, but I must consider the base game to be fair, as most of us didn't even have internet access back in those days. But yeah, if all I can criticize about this game are some dragged-on races and a wish for more cars and tracks against the sheer content it boasts, isn't this just a sign of an awesome game? As a final note, the PS1 version of the game graphically doesn't hold up to its PC cousin, of course, and is missing some key features as well. I personally love how the cars handle in the PC version, so I suppose it's either personal preference or nostalgia at play here, or perhaps a combination of both if you somehow prefer the PlayStation 1 version. That said, I actually own a PS Vita that is emulating a PSP, emulating a PS1 to play high stakes on the go. As mentioned, it's not the same experience as the PC version, but hey, I get to play this masterpiece on the road, so I can't complain. You can also just use your PSP directly as well if you still have one of those legends lying around, as this old friend will do the trick just fine. In the race of gaming history, Need for Speed 4 High Stakes may not have been the shiniest sports car that caught the most attention, but it still crossed the finish line with a tire-squealing impact, leaving a lasting mark on the asphalt of innovation. While not typically listed under the greatest or most influential racing games of all time, it definitely revved up its engines to push the Need for Speed franchise forward, with graphics that shimmered like chrome under the sun and a UI smoother than a well-waxed hood. But as you can see, it wasn't just a pretty paint job. Beneath the surface, High Stakes boasted a sophisticated damage system in which cars crumbled and bent as you pushed through the high-octane showdowns where every dent carried consequences. These scars bear witness to the intense battles you waged on the tracks as you raced to be first to the coveted finish line. It was, and still is in my opinion, one hell of a fun game. So, as we reflect on the legacy of Need for Speed 4, let us not forget the roar of its engine or the burning rubber it left on the road. While it did suffer from some flaws like most games, it still stands as a testament of what I consider a complete package in a racing game, reminding us that sometimes the true champions of innovation were the hidden gems that raced on these roads before the giants of Underground and Most Wanted. And as we venture into the future, may the spirit of High Stakes somehow return to Electronic Arts one day. One can only hope. Thank you for watching, everyone, and be sure to subscribe to Gamenoob for more game reviews and commentaries. I appreciate the support. Stay happy, be good to each other, and see you all in the next one.